Um, I'm a dad. I'm a dad of 3 boys, and just after my first son was born, my wife and I and little Liam, we moved to Halifax in Canada, where I went to study oceanography. We moved from Germany, and we were both students, so we didn't have very much money at all. And one of the most important things for us as a young family was eating well, and so we spent most of our money on food. Now, Halifax has a very vibrant farmers market community. And we soon discovered that we could get way more fruit and veggies for our money there than at the local supermarkets. Especially, I remember there was one farmer, he was of similar age and also a family father, and we just would pick what we wanted from his stall, put it into our basket, and he would eyeball a price for it. And he told me about varieties of tomatoes that he was growing and about how he was heating his greenhouse through the harsh Canadian winters to produce greens. And the veggies we bought there were so fresh and good quality that they lasted way longer in our fridge if we didn't eat them right away than any other food. And by talking to the farmers, we started to really appreciate knowing where our food comes from and what it takes to produce it. I was feeling really good about directly supporting the local farmers of my region and also reducing my carbon footprint because the food that I was consuming wasn't coming from very far away. Now, between 2020 and 2023, there were over 1,000 high seas transshipments carried out far away from land in the Western Central Pacific. These were carried out with very little oversight. And these 1,000 events were done by the vessels that are on the FFA good standing list. So vessels that should be abiding by the rules. Now, for me, the connection between the farmers markets and fishery is location. Location is very powerful to me. It immediately invokes an image in my mind, and I hope in yours as well. We associate things like home, familiar places, and good quality. So it's also very much used in marketing to convey quality of goods. When fish is transferred on the high seas, you lose location. You lose the knowledge of where the fish was caught and who caught it. You don't get to speak to the fishermen who often never see the land for over a year. Moreover, vast amounts of fuel are burned by reefer vessels steaming around constantly in areas that are too deep to anchor. So high seas transshipments are undesirable, and they're undesirable for many reasons. I'd like to first thank the World Maritime University for inviting me to give this presentation here, especially also Kathleen and Francisco for guiding me here and helping me prepare my presentation. So thank you very much. And today's topic, I'd like to talk about a research project that I've been part of, where we took a detailed look at the practice of high seas transshipments in the Western Central Pacific, especially the WCPFC convention area. This work started under the initiative of Francisco Blaha and Bo Begler of the Marshall Islands Marine Resource Authority, or MIMRA, and included my colleague Fernando Cagua, who was then at Starboard and now works for Global Fishing Watch. Funding for the study was provided by the Pacific European Union Marine Partnership, or PIUM, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. And our report was recently presented at the WCPFC Technical Compliance Meeting by the Marshall Islands, and it is available for download at the website that I've listed down here at the bottom. And I believe you get the presentations at the end to take home and look at your leisure. And at this meeting, our findings received significant attention because they provided quantitative evidence that existing regulations, especially the Conservation Management Measure CMM 2009-06, are ineffective. And so I'd like to talk about how we got there today. And because this is a capacity building academy, I thought rather than focusing on the results of our study, I'd like to describe how we went about doing it, how we came up with the methodology. Because one of our goals of that study was also to develop a framework so that others can repeat and adapt our methodology. And I hope you find this useful. So how did we come up with this topic in the first place? We knew high seas transshipments are undesirable for many reasons. But how big is the problem in relation to other issues? Now, as a scientist, I like to do reading, and I read a lot of reports. And one of the most relevant reports is the quantification of IUU fishing in the Pacific Islands region, a 2020 update by EMRAG Asia Pacific. Excellent report. And one of the report's main conclusions is that the most significant factor contributing to the overall volume of IUU fishing in the Commission area is misreporting. Particular focus should be on strengthening measures to monitor and validate catch on longline vessels as it moves through the supply chain. So as a scientist who likes to run different projects and work on interesting problems, I call this kind of statement a nugget. It's a succinct factual statement that's from a well-respected source, and it expresses a central problem that lends itself for further investigation, such as, why is the catch not validated? So digging a little deeper, because it happens on the high seas, and the current reporting and observation is inefficient and is not standardized. But wait a minute, isn't high seas transshipment prohibited? The CMM 2009-06 says there shall be no transshipment on the high seas. And then it keeps on going, of course, except where a CCM has determined that it is impracticable for certain vessels to operate without being able to transship on the high seas, and has advised the Commission of such. So there is the impracticability exemption. And so in order for fishing vessels to be exempt from the prohibition of transshipping on the high seas, a vessel needs to meet one of two criteria: either significant economic hardship or significant changes in the historical mode of operation. The changes to the historical mode of operation I'm not going to deal with here today, so I'll just focus on the economic hardship in this presentation. So the exemption says that the restriction on high seas transshipment must cause significant cost for transshipping or landing at other locations compared to total operating cost. So that means that exception can be made if going into a port is way more expensive than transshipment on the high seas. What does that actually mean? What does it actually look like for a fishing vessel to do its operation and transship on the high seas? What kind of detour does it make? So just showing you the plot of a typical distant water fleet longliner. It's coming from Southeast Asia, Korea in this case, traveling 3,000 or 4,000 miles to the Western Central Pacific, conducting fishing operations in various high seas areas and various exclusive economic zones of the regional nations here. And then it goes to a certain place and meets a carrier vessel for transshipment, and that's happening right here. This is a typical pattern, and before I go on, I have to say a few words about our data source here. The blown up map that you are seeing here now is our Starboard screen. So Starboard is a maritime domain awareness platform. This platform is primarily based on automated identification system, or AIS data. It has an archive of global vessel tracks that goes back to 2020, and this allows the user to select one or more vessels and a time frame to see exactly what this vessel has been up to over the period of time that we have a record of it. This platform is used by the FFA and the fisheries departments of all of its member states and other organizations worldwide. Now, in Starboard, the system automatically analyzes vessel tracks as they are being recorded and detects certain behaviors. For example, the the detections, the behaviors that we detect are listed in this little insert here. Of most interest for us right now are these transshipment detections, inferred transshipment and likely transshipment, and fishing events. So transshipments are shown with red track lines, and fishing events are shown in these pink track lines. So these are the two most important events for our purposes here. So we set out to investigate the economic hardship argument, and we were asking, is going into a port actually uneconomic? And if we can show that going into a port represents only a small detour, then the argument of economic hardship would not hold, and that vessel owners could potentially be approached to justify this high seas transshipment formally. Now, furthermore, if we can show that this argument does not hold in many cases, we can make an argument that the policy set out in the conservation management measure is insufficient. So we set out to measure vessel tracks in starboard. This is our example, distant water fishing fleet longliner here. And the journey components I've marked up in these bold arrows. So there's about a 3,000 nautical mile distance from the home port to the fishing grounds. And then the vessel engages in various fishing activities in various places and a lot of sections of transit back and forth. So just as a rough estimate, the distance between this end of the arrow and this beginning of the arrow is about 2,500 miles. That's a straight line distance. I just eyeballed that. It's not important for particular analysis. This is just setting it into context, the distances we're talking about here. Now, then we look at specifically some parts of this behavior. And zooming into the time and the location of this high seas transshipment. Same vessel, just zoomed into this area here. This is where the high seas transshipment takes place. This is where the vessel was fishing before it went onto this trip towards the transshipment location. So the vessel went up here for about 750 nautical miles. Along the way, it passed by a port in PNG here at a distance of about 180 miles. So we figured all we had to do is measure the distances of all these transshipment events, and if it's quicker or similar to go into a port than to go for a high seas transshipment, then the argument of economic hardship is flawed. And so this sounded really easy. And some people who've done this are laughing out. So vessel tracks are really complicated. I mean, including this one we're looking at here. Here's another one. Vessel comes from home port to the Western Central Pacific, does just fishing activity, moves between high seas pockets. On its track, and I've marked the transshipment ports in the region with these turquoise location markers here. These ports are never really approached. So there are 1,000 miles or long distances between them. So furthermore, the location of transshipment is right up here, and you can see that the vessel has been active setting lines right around that area. So it's hanging around, doing its thing, spending its time, while possibly it was waiting for the carrier vessels catching fish. And so potentially the distance to that transshipment is really, really small. However, there is a lot of activity going on, a lot of traveling going on that would have to be taken into account. So we came up with a measure, a location that identifies the center, the geographical center of the fishing activity. So this geographical center is this little blue dot here in the middle. And we used that center point as the origin for our measurements. So we were measuring the distance from the center point to the transshipment location and from the center point to the nearest transshipment port. Now, as in the first example that I showed, some of the Here are those distances. So they compare, again, the trip to the transshipment in the high seas, in this case, is longer, 688 miles, in case you can't read it from, due to the cable in the back there, versus about 500 miles to Funafuti. Now, we also figured that the vessels, like in the first case of our first example, that a vessel might pass by a transshipment port. So we looked at the closest approach to a port within 2 weeks either side of the transshipment event. And in this case, I think it is going to Kiribati at about 480 miles. This part of the track is within 2 weeks of the transshipment event. So it's another distance that we've taken into account. Then we've taken these distances, and essentially, just to repeat, when the distances from the main fishing area to the location of transshipment is greater than the distance to a suitable port, a transshipment in port would actually be more favorable economically. So we went to eyeball the central fishing location for about 50 transshipment events and measured these distances. And that was a really important exercise, because by doing that, we really got to know what these vessels are up to and the diversity in vessel tracks and behaviors. But doing this for 1,000 vessels is impossible. And also for reproducibility, for scientific reasons, you need a formal way to determine the geographical center of fishing events that you can measure those distances from. So Fernando came up with an automation. What he did is essentially download all the vessel tracks and the locations of the fishing and transshipment events, and then crunched the numbers. And we did some automated normalization that would show us whether it would be more economic to go into a port versus transship on the high seas. And here are the results. For almost half of the high seas transshipments, and these are all the high seas transshipments that we used in our study, a port would have been closer. That's 43% here. Only about 4% of the cases, a port would be about equal distance. Then the argument can be made that under best operational practices, the port should have been chosen as a transshipment location, because either way you don't gain or lose much by going there. And then there are about the other half where the transshipment location is a bit further away from the port, so that the journey is actually a little more expensive, or maybe much more expensive, if it was going into a port versus to the transshipments. So this is sort of our main finding here that we've made. We drilled a little bit deeper, and the results can be looked at in many different ways. And I just like to summarize a few major findings here and invite you to look up the tables in the report, because we know who's involved in each of the transshipment events, who the carrier vessel is and who the fishing vessel is. We can determine whether particular vessels have particular preferences for going out of their way to do transshipment or not. And so we found that there are a number of vessels that are characterized by going out of their way a long way, out of the way of a port for a long way, rather than others who may only do this occasionally, or perhaps where the distance differential is not that large. Furthermore, some of the carrier vessels that are involved in this activity, some of them receive more fish from fishing vessels that have taken on this extra journey to meet them. So there's a sort of a clear ranking of carrier vessels that are involved in this activity. And then also there's a geographical pattern. We found that some ports miss out more than others when it comes to high seas transshipments, because vessels pass them by more routinely. And the details are again all in the report. So uneconomic high seas transshipments is part of the pattern of life of many of these vessels. They appear to be so associated, they appear to be associations or connections between certain fishing vessels and carrier vessels that are frequently revisited and that hint to on-land relationships and possibly vertical integration of the supply chain. Now, in conclusion, we really enjoyed this project, and Francisco just came up to me and says, hey, I'm really proud of this project. So we really had a good time, and it wasn't actually that hard to do. It was interesting work, and I think what made it so enjoyable was the collaboration. We were collaborating. The project was a collaboration between a National Fisheries Management Agency, MIMRA, Francisco as an external advisor, the regional RFMO, and Starboard as a technology provider. And so this is again a coming together where the result is more than the sum of its parts. And of course, we're very grateful for the EU funding that enabled us to do this work. So part of the success, we really, in the spirit of what Yoni's been mentioning, is the regional collaboration here. It's been really awesome. We have then used publicly available data. So this is all AIS data, which is available and is made available for free, for example, in the Global Fishing Watch platforms. Using publicly available data and a technology tool, we showed the economic hardship argument for justifying an exemption to the ban on high seas transshipment does not hold for large amounts of cases. And by applying our analysis to a representative number of vessels, of events, we were able to make a general statement that these regulations need some work. And I know that the Convention's intersessional working group on transshipments is working constantly, and I'm really curious to see what they come up with in the future. Just to close the circle, better control and monitoring of at-sea transshipments provides a sense of location. Knowledge of this location enables better transparency of the fishery and traceability of the catch. And it helps fishers and local economies to manage the resources more sustainably and have better financial returns for the coastal states. So I hope you found this interesting. I do encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to repeat some of the analysis, and if you have access to Starboard, or you could use Global Fishing Watch for that as well, I believe, perhaps also Skylight. And that should reveal a bunch of interesting findings, really, and interesting questions for further investigation, because there's certainly scope for digging deeper. And as a nugget for perhaps your next analysis, what you could try is to look at the other type of vessels that support distant water fishing and high seas transshipments, and those are the bunker vessels. So you could take a look there. And with that, I say Bula Vinaka, and happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks so much for a fascinating presentation. Does anyone have any comments or questions for Moritz? Yep, Raphael.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting presentation, and really great to see that. I just have a small question. Have you also studied and tried to reconstruct the journey of the reefer vessels, of the supply vessels, and do you have something that you try to combine, or is something which is a next step?
Yeah, our report had a whole chapter on reefer vessels. We found that in this period of time, most of the transshipments, and I can't remember the percentage, maybe 60 or 70%, were done by 8 vessels. The total number of vessels that we found active there were probably around 25, and there were what we call the central carrier vessels that were responsible for most of these high seas transshipments. And we looked at their pattern of life, and they were all very similar. We did, they travel to the areas and spend about 50 to 100 days at sea, and then they go back to their home ports. In many cases, they don't go into a regional port at all. And Then we conducted a network analysis that connects the carrier vessels and the fishing vessels. And that showed certainly associations between flag states and between certain groups. So we did dig a little bit deeper. We also listed the ownership of all the fishing vessels and the carrier vessels in the report. But the main conclusions, and I think this is where future work can come in, is we did not quantify the economic cost of carrier vessel activity. So the fuel that is burned and the time is spent at sea. That's a component we just didn't get to in the scope of our things, but it's certainly a very important component for the overall economic feasibility of the practice.
Great. Any more questions? Yes, the back, Marie.
You mentioned about that it was uneconomical for them to conduct transhipment, but they still did it, so they would have to be recovering a cost somehow, somewhere. So I suppose the question is, why are they still conducting transhipment?
Yeah, why are they spending more money on fuel and time to go to a high seas transshipment compared to a shorter distance in port? And that's a really good question that goes to the core of the practice. Are the companies between the carrier vessels and the fishing boat operators connected so that the profits go more in a more straight line to the beneficial owners of these when they're preferentially transshipping at sea? Or are there other, perhaps more illicit activities going on outside of the oversight of a regional port? And that is something that it really needs to be looked at, and we're interested in, but as a data-driven exercise, we did not make any connections between any particular behavior.
Good, thank you so much.